Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Flesch, and I am the director of the Mining and Rollo-Jameson Museums. And welcome to this second of 7 presentations as part of the 2022 Winter Lyceum. Today is the 27th day of February 2022, and I'm broadcasting from Platteville, Wisconsin, home of the world's largest letter M on beautiful Platte Mound in the heart of the upper Mississippi Valley lead and zinc mining region where the Badger State was born. Reflecting on a wonderful year behind us, the museum campus celebrated 3 milestone anniversaries last year. Founded in 1965 by the city of Platteville, in 2021, the museum marked the 50th anniversary of the opening of the mining museum, the 45th anniversary of the opening of the Bevins mine in the museum backyard, and the 40th anniversary of the opening of the Rollo-Jameson Museum. And we have many special programs and initiatives in store for this new year that celebrates 13,000 years of human ingenuity, inquiry, enterprise, and development, what might be called the pioneering spirit in the context of our driftless area landscape. I invite you to stay up to date on these programs, as well as to make your reservations and to support current initiatives online at www.mining.jameson.museum. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the museum's annual celebration of African American History Month. Today we'll enjoy a presentation by Dr. Eugene Tesdahl and Dr. Joshua Wachuta, titled Ho-Chunk Sovereignty, Black Voices, and Driftless Lead Boom. Because you're all here to hear the views and the opinions of these speakers, of course, the Mining and Rollo-Jameson Museums are not only a place where history is preserved in a spirit of inclusivity, equity, and diversity, but also a place where the sense of place of our driftless region and the pioneering legacy of its people are shared with the next generation. I'd like to thank all of you who have registered to participate live today, as well as those who may be watching a recording of this event from our library of virtual programs. I extend a warm welcome to the current friends of the Mining and Rollo-Jameson, members and donors in particular, and I'd like to thank the sponsors whose financial support has made this program possible. A&W Restaurant of Platteville, Edward Jones Financial Advisor Bob Hundhausen, FEH Design of Dubuque, H&R Block, Inspiring Community, and our media sponsor, Voice of the River Valley. And now, before we begin our program, I'd like to invite each of you to participate in a question and answer session at the end of this evening's live presentation. Because we're such a large group, more than 140 people, and we're doing this via Zoom, in the interest of time, I'd like to invite you to type out your questions as they come to mind and submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen during the talk. So if I might just invite you to take a quick moment and look for that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, which is different than the chat function you might be familiar with. At the end, the speakers will answer as many of the questions as they are able in the order in which they are received. So I'm pleased now to introduce tonight's speakers. Dr. Josh Wachuta is an independent historian specializing in the history of the upper Mississippi River Valley region. He attained his BA in history at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse and completed his master's and PhD in U.S. and Public History at Loyola University, Chicago. Dr. Tesdahl, an associate professor of history at the UW Platteville. He earned a BA in history from Luther College, an MA in history from Miami University, and his PhD in history from the University of Colorado at Boulder. Dr. Tesdahl specializes in Native American history, early American history, women's history, and public history. Recent publications address Haudenosaunee cosmology and illegal slavery in Wisconsin. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to go ahead and try and start my screen share here. Well, I want to thank Eric and thank the Mining and Rollo-Jameson Museum for hosting this event. And I also want to take a moment before starting the presentation to acknowledge that I'm here in Grant County as a settler on land that has belonged not only to the Ho-Chunk Nation, but also to Saulteaux, Potawatomi, Iowa, Kickapoo, and Miami peoples at various times. So I want to acknowledge them and acknowledge the sacrifices that each of those nations has made in the face of US colonialism. I also want to observe that history always reflects points of view. And I'm a white historian. I do not speak Ho-Chunk. So the stories that I'm telling are based on English language documents preserved in United States archives. And that means that this is a partial perspective, and we should always be aware of that as we consider the types of stories and viewpoints that have been preserved for historical analysis. Just to give a brief outline of what we'll be discussing tonight, I'm going to begin by speaking about Ho-Chunk sovereignty and treaties between the United States and the Ho-Chunk Nation during the early 19th century. And then I'll pass the screen share on to Dr. Tesdahl to speak about Black voices from the Driftless boom and offer a conclusion to really show how deeply connected Native American history and Black history in the Driftless region are. And then, as Eric said, we'll have time for questions for both parts of the discussion at the end. The Ho-Chunk Nation is one of 11 federally recognized indigenous nations in Wisconsin today. And of those, it is one of two, along with the Menominee Nation, whose origin story has the very beginnings of the nation in what is now Wisconsin. So the Ho-Chunk people have deep, deep ties to this region. And their name, Ho-Chunk or Ho-Chungra, means people of the sacred voice, people of the parent speech, people of the big voice. There are various translations, but these all refer to the significance of the Ho-Chunk language, which is linguistically rather different. It's in a different language family than most of the languages spoken by surrounding nations. And as a result of this, the name Ho-Chunk, although that has always been the Ho-Chunk people's name for themselves in their own language, was not the name used for them by most French or English-speaking colonists who used the name given to them by their Algonquian-speaking neighbors, which is Winnebago. So in a number of the quotes I'll share tonight, which are of course in English, you'll see the name Winnebago. But again, that was the name given to them by outsiders. Ho-Chunk was the name that they always used for themselves. And the Ho-Chunk Nation socially and politically was traditionally made up of 12 clans and is still made up of 12 clans in two divisions of earth and sky. Things like the Thunder Clan and Eagle Clan in the Sky Division, or the Bear Clan and the Deer Clan in the Earth Division. And each of these clans had a specific set of political and social responsibilities for the welfare of the nation as a whole. And we'll see a little bit more about that later in the discussion. As the United States established relationships with the Ho-Chunk Nation, the Ho-Chunks had a very diverse economy. They were a very agricultural people with agricultural villages throughout much of what's now Wisconsin, growing corn and other crops. They were also engaged in hunting and engaged in the fur trade with European colonial powers. And they were involved in mining, which is of course significant in this region. And archaeology has shown that lead from the upper Mississippi Valley was traded throughout much of Eastern North America as many as 3,000 years ago. So well before European colonization, lead was an important good used to make paint and pigments and ornamental goods. Of course, when Europeans arrived in the region, they brought new uses for lead, primarily for musket balls and ammunition, but also for some other things. And lead became a trade good with Europeans as well. And this was a part of the Ho-Chunk economy. Spoon or Chukiga Decora recalled the significance of lead mining when he was interviewed in the 1880s, noting the importance of lead as a trade good with other Indians for supplies of all sorts. And this mining could take on an industrial scale. Esau Johnson, an American settler, visited the Ho-Chunk mine at Sugar River in 1828. And his description includes women, Ho-Chunk women digging at a depth of 40 feet, 52 furnaces. These would be stone furnaces built into the side of a hill, actively in blasts melting the lead with 100,000 pounds of lead on hand. So this was a very significant commercial enterprise by the 1820s. But of course, this valuable resource also led to conflicts, particularly as Americans and American miners began to covet the value of this lead. And this led to a conflict over sovereignty. Sovereignty, of course, refers to self-determination or self-governance, and also often refers to who has ultimate authority or control over an area of territory. And the US has always extended some recognition of sovereignty to Native nations, recognized that Native people had governments that pre-existed the government of the United States and had authority that existed outside of any constitutional authority of the United States government. It engaged in treaties with Native nations from a very early day, which is a sign of that type of recognition. But the US has also never recognized Native nations in quite the same way that it has recognized nations in Europe or in the Old World. And so there are a lot of nuances and complexities that we could get into there in the Q&A. But important for our purposes is that in the early 19th century, the United States, because of the demand for lead and minerals, became involved in really seeking to undermine and supplant and erase Ho-Chunk sovereignty in this region, which is really reflected in this passage from George Fenshaw about the changing authority of figures from the Ho-Chunk chief whirling thunder to the Wisconsin governor, Henry Dodge. Before getting directly into treaties between the United States and Ho-Chunk people, it's important that we take account of a few other treaties with other nations of the Upper Mississippi Valley that had a large bearing on the lead region and Ho-Chunk history. And the first of those was the Treaty of St. Louis of 1804. William Henry Harrison was the governor of Indiana Territory, and in 1804, he traveled from the seat of Indiana Territory in Vincent to St. Louis. And while there, he met 5 members of the Sauk and Muskogee nations visiting from Quashquemé's village. They were there on other business, but William Henry Harrison persuaded them to put their X marks on a document they could not read, which purported to sell all of this territory east of the Mississippi River, as well as some territory west of the Mississippi River, to the United States for $1,000 a year. It's very clear that the men who signed this treaty did not understand the terms that were set forth in the written document. And it's also very clear that these 5 people had not been sent to St. Louis for this purpose, had not been authorized by the tribal councils of the Sauk and Muskogee nations to sell this land, that these northern villages weren't even aware of the treaty until afterward. And another problem with this treaty is that the borders that Harrison drew up in the treaty actually encompassed a lot of land in the northern portion that was occupied and claimed not only by Sauk and Muskogee people, but by Potawatomi and Ho-Chunk people. So as word of this treaty spread, and as the United States insisted on carrying out the terms of this treaty despite protests, this led to a lot of tension. Black Hawk, the Sauk leader, would say that this was the origin of all our serious difficulties with the whites. And it was one factor that led the Sauk and Muskogee, Ho-Chunk, and Potawatomi, and other native nations of the Upper Mississippi Valley to ally with each other and with Great Britain against the United States during the War of 1812. That war, militaristically, ended in something of a draw. But in the wake of the war, the United States would again make treaties with a number of native nations from this region. Most of these were just peace treaties agreeing to lay down arms, but the treaty with the Council of Three Fires is very significant for the lead region. The Council of Three Fires was an alliance between the Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Odawa nations throughout the Great Lakes region, but in this part of the region, it was primarily the Potawatomi that represented that alliance. And the United States wanted to purchase a tract of land around Chicago. And in order to facilitate this, the US agreed to grant the Council of Three Fires Potawatomi the northern portion of the territory it purported to have purchased from the Sauk and Meskwaki in 1804, which is this shaded area. There were some issues with this, including the fact that Ho-Chunks who lived on the Rock River in this region were not present at the St. Louis Council. And also Meskwaki people continued to maintain that they had never really agreed to anything in 1804 and still lived in this region, which meant that Potawatomi people never really occupied most of this territory because Ho-Chunk and Meskwaki people were there. But the US from 1816 on recognized this as Potawatomi or Council of Three Fires territory. And buried in this treaty was a clause that granted the United States reservations. One reservation was located at the mouth of the Wisconsin River for military purposes, and that was drawn out on this map. But there was another reservation of 5 leagues square that wasn't located specifically in the treaty. Instead, the treaty allowed the president to locate it somewhere within this territory. And that was actually inserted by the negotiators specifically to give the United States an entrance into the lead mining region, because Americans were aware of the value of the mineral resources of the upper Mississippi Valley. So using that kind of vague clause in the 1816 treaty, the US would begin sending miners into the upper Mississippi Valley in 1822. And the way that this worked is kind of complex. I won't get into all the details, but the US viewed lead and other minerals as important strategic resources. Lead, of course, is used in ammunition. And so the US maintained federal authority over these mineral deposits, would not sell them to private individuals, but would lease them under the supervision of the US War Department. Superintendents of lead mines were appointed for this purpose. And it's notable that the War Department was also responsible in the 1820s for maintaining treaties and relationships with Native nations as well. So the US extended leases to white miners in the 1820s, and in 1822 sent the first leaseholders to the Fever River, to what's now Galena, Illinois, with a military escort, and held a council with the Meskwaki people who were still living there, who agreed to allow these people to begin mining. They didn't actually make a new treaty because the US held that the Meskwaki had already sold their land in the 1804 treaty, although Meskwaki people may have differed about that. So this begins at first a gradual flow of miners into the region. But Lieutenant Martin Thomas, who was appointed as the superintendent of lead mine overseeing this leasing program, decided to interpret the 1816 Potawatomi Treaty very loosely to allow him to locate leases really anywhere within this vast territory. They didn't have to be on a single tract, according to his interpretation. They could be spread out here and there, as long as the total amount of land did not exceed 5 leagues square, which is an area of 15 miles by 15 miles. And even then, he never actually bothered to survey the leases that he was making. So there was no real accountability for how much area would be taken up by miners. And this would lead, as we shall see, to a number of tensions. The next important treaty involving the Ho-Chunk Nation directly in the upper Mississippi Valley was the Treaty of Prairie in 1825. And in contrast to most of the treaties I'm describing tonight, this was not a treaty in which the United States directly purchased land from any native nation, but instead, the US asked all of the nations of the upper Mississippi Valley, including the Ho-Chunks, to come to Prairie du Chien to agree on boundaries between themselves. And it said ostensibly that this was for the purpose of ensuring peace, that if there were clearly defined borders, that it would prevent warfare between different nations. And Americans may have legitimately thought that way. Native people did not necessarily think that way. They had not had a tradition of having clearly demarcated borders, and in fact viewed the idea of peace as a willingness to share resources, to share land. And you can get a sense of that from the speech of one of the Ho-chunks at the council, Caaxšépsgaaga, or Walking Turtle, who said that his nation had a specific claim of land, but that it was also owned in common by Sacs and Foxes, Menominees, Iowas, Maha, and Sioux, and it would be difficult to divide it. And other speakers from other nations made similar speeches. One of the Ojibwe speakers actually said that drawing borders might actually just be a new thing to fight over that might create new wars rather than promoting peace. But the US continued to ask for borders. And it's possible that the US had an ulterior motive here, because by strictly defining which nation claimed which area of land, that made US administration of these areas a lot simpler, because the US wouldn't have to try and get a consensus from all of these nations together when it sought to purchase an area. It could now just approach one nation at a time and even play these nations against each other, which would be a tactic that the US used later on. But nevertheless, by drawing boundaries in 1825, for the first time, the US would explicitly recognize an area of territory as belonging to the Ho-chunk nation. And you'll note, compared to the previous map of the land that the US had granted to the Potawatomi, now a large part of that area would actually be recognized as actually belonging to Ho-chunk people. And this had implications for the mining region. The border was defined as the ridge separating rivers that flowed into the Mississippi from rivers that flowed into the Rock River. And once again, no Potawatomi people had really moved into this tract of land along the Mississippi River. To the extent that there were native people here, it was largely Meskwaki and Ho-chunk people in the 1820s. But the US again maintained that the Meskwaki had abandoned any claim in 1804. And it was only the Potawatomi Treaty that had authorized the US to begin mining here. So they continued to recognize this as Potawatomi land. And the 1825 treaty really implied that US mining could only take place on the Potawatomi side of that border in a reservation on the Fever River. And Article 10 actually explicitly has the US agreeing to all of these boundaries negotiated between Native nations, but also the Native nations agreeing to recognize a reservation on the Fever River, which is Galena, where mining was taking place, as well as on the Wisconsin and St. Peters River, where the US had built forts. But unfortunately, no sooner really was this treaty made in August of 1825 than the US would break it. Because it was just after this that what's known as the lead rush would heat up in this region. You can see the number of mining permits and leases that the US issued from 1825 to 1827 increased exponentially. And as I said, Lieutenant Thomas, who was in charge of this leasing program, would issue leases not only for along the Fever River where Galena is, but really throughout not only the Potawatomi Treaty territory, but Ho-chunk Nation territory, closer and closer to Ho-chunk villages. Now, this did not necessarily have to result in tensions, and it's true that there were some miners who worked diligently to try and establish good relationships between themselves and the Ho-chunks. Perhaps the most notable example of that was the Ratchet family. Henry and Charles Ratchet came from Missouri shortly after the 1825 treaty, and they were from a French fur trading family in St. Louis related to the Chouteaus, the most important fur trade family there. And so they knew how to negotiate with Native people. And the Ratchets actually employed a woman of mixed French Ho-chunk ancestry named Catherine Mayotte to work for them regularly as an interpreter so that they could converse with Ho-chunk people, exchange gifts, carry on regular trade. And because of this, they won Ho-chunk respect and trust. But unfortunately, the Ratchets were an exception, and they were just one of many, many miners rushing into this territory in 1826 and 1827. You can see where Ratchet's Grove is down here, and you can also see just the tremendous number of other miners coming into the territory, most of them not making any effort to accommodate Ho-Chunk interests. So Ho-Chunk leaders used their diplomatic channels with the United States to register complaints about this. And in the summer and spring of 1827, protests were lodged with U.S. Indian agents John Connolly and Thomas Forsyth. John Connolly said that Wanįg-sučka, who had a village down here on the Pecatonica River, complained about the violations of the Treaty of 1825 with all of these miners coming across the border onto their lands, and blamed the U.S. Superintendent of Lead Mines, Lieutenant Thomas, for encouraging this. And Thomas Forsyth also pointed the finger at Lieutenant Thomas for giving people licenses to work on Winnebago lands. And Forsyth even indicated that Lieutenant Thomas was almost encouraging violence, saying that people asked if Indians order them away, what is to be done? And Lieutenant Thomas said, "You must remain there until blood is spilled and something will be done." So by the summer of 1827, the lead mining region is already primed for and expecting violence. And indeed, unfortunately, violence would break out. But interestingly, the bloodshed that occurred actually came from an unexpected direction. It came from north of the lead mining region, when in June of 1827, 3 Ho-Chunk men from the village at Prairie, Wanįg-sučka, or Redbird, Wachuta, and Chitoshnika, Little Buffalo, murdered members of the Gagne household living on the outskirts of the fur trading village at Prairie Chien. And then just a couple of days later, others from the same Prairie village became involved in a skirmish with a keelboat on the Mississippi River. And in that exchange of fire, some Ho-Chunks were killed and 2 Americans aboard the keelboat were killed. Now, it's very clear from the investigations into these incidents that happened afterwards, and from the trials that would take place later, and all the testimony that was gathered, that these events had their own motives that were not directly connected to the lead mining region. The incident in Prairie du Chien seems to have been motivated by false information that Wanįg-sučka had received about the alleged murder of Ho-Chunk prisoners in US custody. This hadn't actually happened. He was acting on a false rumor, but tragically acted to exact revenge for these people that he thought had been killed. And the attack on the keelboat, there were allegations that this keelboat crew had actually abducted or abused women from the Ho-Chunk village at La Crosse, prompting this exchange of fire. But regardless of this, as I said, the lead mining region was already primed to expect violence in 1827. And so as soon as word of these things reached the lead miners, it triggered a panic, and it triggered an expectation that there would now be an all-out war between the Ho-Chunk nation and the United States. So miners fled, retreated from their diggings to Galena, which became kind of a central rallying point where they formed into militias. And the US federal government sent its troops from St. Louis north into the lead mining region to reinforce Fort Crawford and Prairie du Chien, and ultimately to strike out on an expedition into Ho-Chunk territory, expecting a war. And they called it the Winnebago War. But in fact, there wouldn't really be a war. No more fighting really took place. And that was largely thanks to the actions of other Ho-Chunk leaders from other Ho-Chunk villages, who quickly acted to distance themselves from the actions of Wanįg-sučka and his band, saying that this was not the policy of the Ho-Chunk nation as a whole, that they did not endorse the violence that had taken place along the Mississippi River that summer. And in order to restore trust, one Ho-Chunk leader, Caaxšépsgaaga, or White War Eagle de Cora, actually allowed himself to be taken prisoner by the United States at Fort Crawford and held there until his people could deliver the accused murderers into US custody. So this helped to kind of restore trust. And by September, Wanįg-sučka, or Redbird, as well as the people who had acted with him, surrendered into US custody peacefully at Portage and were then taken to Fort Crawford in Prairie du Chien. Wanįg-sučka died shortly thereafter in the US prison. The others would go on to face trial. Some of them would be convicted, some of them would not. But despite the restoration of peace, unfortunately, trespass by miners would now not only continue, but intensify, as miners are emboldened by the presence of more US troops and by their own organization of militias. Esau Johnson, the man who earlier I had mentioned described the Ho-Chunk mining at Sugar River, actually in his journal recorded getting into armed brawls, armed with knives and clubs, with Ho-Chunk people, just pushing them off of areas where they had been mining. But the most notorious trespasser in this period was Henry Dodge, who had come to the region from Missouri in 1827 as part of the militia campaign that summer. And then in the winter, set up a fortified mining and smelting operation on Ho-Chunk land across the border. And according to Dodge's story, he had received permission from one Ho-Chunk man named the Bear to dig for lead where he set up diggings. But it's pretty clear that the Ho-Chunks, if they gave him permission, were not expecting him to bring up as many people as he did and to build a fort on their land. And so they complained to the US Indian agent, Joseph Street, who had been appointed Indian agent just after this violence in 1827, sort of in the aftermath. And Corumna told Joseph Street, a large camp has gone into our country, taking lead where it's easy to pick out, where Indians have been making lead for many years. We did not expect this. We want to know when this will stop. So Street actually requested a detachment of US troops to evict Henry Dodge from his position in Ho-Chunk territory. But the US military now said that it did not have enough troops to spare for this purpose and was unwilling to get into an engagement with Dodge's fortified position. So ultimately, the US approved Dodge's mining and issued him a valid license, even though he was on Ho-Chunk land that the US really didn't have authority to issue a lease or a license to mine on. Joseph Street, as Indian agent, was responsible for enforcing and maintaining the terms of treaties that had been agreed to. So he did try, to the extent that he could, to enforce the terms of the previous 1825 treaty and the boundaries that were agreed to then. But it's also clear that really from the beginning of his duty after Wanįg-sučka's surrender in 1827, that he believed the only real solution to these tensions was for the US ultimately to end Ho-Chunk sovereignty over this region by acquiring the lead region for itself. And he drew up a proposal for that as early as November of 1827, showing the land proposed to be purchased of the Ho-Chunks, as well as from the Council of Three Fires in the lead mining region. And Joseph Street and other US officials would now work very diligently throughout 1828 and 1829 to prevail upon the Ho-Chunk nation to cede its claims to the lead mining region to the United States. The first concerted attempt to do this was at the Treaty of Green Bay in 1828. But in this instance, Ho-Chunk speakers were actually able to at least forestall, at least delay having to cede any territory. Little Elk, or Huánuco, noted that the US seemed to be blaming the whole nation for what Wanįg-sučka and his party had done in 1827, saying, if one of us commits a crime, punish him. Do not make us all suffer. And Wachuta, or Snakeskin Decorah, pointed to the violations of the 1825 treaty that had already taken place, and asked for compensation for the lead that had already been taken from Ho-Chunk lands. So in order to kind of gain Ho-Chunk favor, the US did agree to pay compensation in the 1828 treaty for some of the lead that had been taken, but also demanded and received in this treaty the right of miners to continue crossing unmolested into Ho-Chunk territory. But no land yet was sold. So to again encourage Ho-Chunks to consider ceding land to the United States, the US invited a delegation of Ho-Chunk leaders later in 1828 to visit the president in Washington, D.C. And several Ho-Chunks took part in this delegation. They met President John Quincy Adams at the White House in a formal ceremony in November. Wanįg-sučka presented John Quincy Adams with a peace pipe demonstrating peaceful relations between the Ho-Chunk Nation and the United States. It's actually interesting if you look at the portrait that was drawn of him on this occasion. You can see the peace pipe, and it's made of red catlinite, and there are these white lines on it. It's quite possible that that was actually lead inlay, and many other peace pipes from this period had lead inlay put into them. Wanįg is coming from the lead region, so that's probably what that was. We don't know for sure because we don't have the original artifact. But as part of this negotiation, President Adams agreed to grant a presidential pardon to the Ho-Chunk men who had been convicted of murder for the violence in 1827, allowing their release, but at the same time urging the delegates to agree to a land sale. And if you think about that, that's kind of a contradiction to what Wanįg had said in the council earlier that year, that he's not going to hold individuals responsible, that he really wants the nation to agree to give up land. So finally, in 1829, the Ho-Chunks would meet the United States again at Prairie, Chien, and they understood that they would be expected to give up at least part of the lead mining territory. But they made a number of speeches about their desire and intention to do this the right way. And for them, that meant understanding the important relationships that they had with the land, specifically that different clans had with the land. As I said, there's a division in the Ho-Chunk Nation between earth clans and sky clans. And so speakers in these clans spoke about that difference, the different responsibilities that they had, and really their stewardship relationship with the land, and said, this is not a little thing we are talking about. We hope you have the patience to hear us. But it's clear from reading the treaty journal that the US didn't have a lot of interest in this. They were more interested in things like, where's the boundary going to be? What's the cost going to be? What are the payments going to be? And Ho-Chunk speakers said very explicitly, that's not how we understand land. We don't understand it in this sort of commodity value way. So they agreed to allow Henry Ratchet, the only lead miner in the region that they had really been able to trust, to act for them during the Treaty Council as the one who would sort of negotiate the price to be paid for the land. But unfortunately, despite Henry Ratchet's actions as an intermediary, the Ho-Chunks were very disappointed to find that the US was demanding all of their claim to the lead mining region, not just a part of it, as they had kind of been led to believe during their prior meetings with Adams and in 1828 in Green Bay. And that caused a lot of frustration. Whirling Thunder said, if you can get all of our country, where can we go? We cannot get our living like the whites. We can't live and work as they do. We must not be too crowded. What answer do you want? What can we say more than we have? What can we say tomorrow? We do not work the lead as you do. We wish to raise our own lead in our own way on the piece left. And lead was important, not just commercially, but for rituals and ceremonies that Ho-Chunk people took part in. Philip Millhouse is an archaeologist that has done a lot of work on Native American lead mining, and he kindly shared this image of lead effigies that have been discovered at Ho-Chunk village sites in the Rock River, which is where Whirling Thunder was from. And these may represent turtles. One of the key Ho-Chunk villages on the Rock River was the Turtle Village. located near where Beloit is. So that may be what these are. They may be water spirits or clan symbols. We don't know for sure. But demonstrating one of the uses of lead that Ho-Chunk people had beyond just commercial trade that's being threatened by the US demand for the lead mining region. But ultimately, according to at least one US Treaty Commissioner, Caleb Atwater, the US resorted to threats of violence in alliance with Sauk and Meskwaki bands that were allied with the US at this time, threatening the Ho-Chunks that if they didn't agree to a land sale, that they could face violent action. And so Ho-Chunk people, to maintain the peace, did agree as in a national council at Prairie to sell the lead mining region for an $18,000 a year annuity for 30 years, plus a one-time payment of goods and money worth $30,000, and some other things that were a part of this treaty. It's notable that the Council of Three Fires in the same council at Prairie du Chien agreed to sell its claim to the region as well. That's another interesting story that I'd be happy to answer questions about, but I don't have time for now. But unfortunately, despite the Ho-Chunk Nation's efforts to maintain peace, it would just be a few more years before war broke out once again with the Black Hawk War of 1832. Black Hawk, of course, was Sauk, and in 1832, protesting that the 1804 treaty had never been valid, returned to his home in northern Illinois to plant corn. But the Illinois governor decided to treat this as an invasion, called up the militia. US troops pursued Black Hawk and his people north into Ho-Chunk territory. And Ho-Chunk people reacted to this in a variety of ways. Most of them sought to remain neutral, sought to protect their own villages and corn from the incursion of all of these people into their territory. Some actually acted as scouts and informants for the US military. And it would actually be Ho-Chunks who helped deliver Black Hawk himself to surrender to the US at Prairie du Chien at the end of the war. But despite that, at the end of the Black Hawk War, the US would demand more land, not only from the Sauk and Meskwaki, but also from the Ho-Chunks and Potawatomi. And this would set in place, just a short number of years later, the process of what the US called Indian removal, and the removal of the Ho-Chunk people from Wisconsin, first to Iowa, then to Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, other places. Ho-Chunk people, of course, always resisted this removal, though, always sought to maintain a place in their homeland, to maintain sovereignty here. Finally, in the 1870s, the US began allowing Ho-Chunk people to start buying individual parcels of land, but it wouldn't be until finally the 20th century that the US once again recognized the Ho-Chunk Nation of Wisconsin as having a sovereign self-governance here in Wisconsin. So that's Ho-Chunk sovereignty in the driftless lead boom. I'd now like to pass the baton on to Dr. Tesdahl to talk about the African-American experience in this period and the very interesting interrelationships that it has with this history.
Thank you, Dr. Wachuta. And I'm sure others learned a lot. I did too. And now I will get into mine and I will share my screen. And so both Director Flesch and Dr. Wachuta have touched on wonderful things. The story that we are talking about tonight is part of over 12,000 years of human history in the Driftless region, and most of that story is an indigenous story. Also, what I'm about to show you is that how it is often the case, it's impossible to fully disconnect indigenous history from African-American history. Many of the names that Dr. Wachuta just mentioned, you will see that some of those people who were in some cases trading with Ho-Chunk people or working to strip land from Ho-Chunk people were also enslaving African-Americans at the same time in the same place. So here's a brief map to show you some of these same places we've been talking about, from Galena, Illinois to Prairie du Chien. I also have on here significant free Black farming communities, Pleasant Ridge near Lancaster, Wisconsin, and Cheyenne Valley up near Hillsboro, Wisconsin. Both of those communities were founded in the mid-19th century, just a little bit after the purview of the period we're talking about tonight. But I thought this, again, sends a message of the centrality of place in the history that is unfolding tonight. So some of you might not know that African Americans have been in Wisconsin since at least 1712 and possibly the late 17th century. And most who were taken to Wisconsin first were taken illegally against their will, enslaved by French fur traders in places like the Bay or Green Bay and places between Bayfield, Wisconsin and Duluth, Minnesota. That's also one of the places where some of the first free Blacks came to Wisconsin by the 1770s, a man named Pierre Bonga, who was a free Black fur trader and ultimately a worker for the Northwest Fur Company. But so chattel slavery came into Wisconsin in the French period. It went into the British period after 1763. And then as part of the negotiations for a thing called the US Constitution, the Northwest Ordinance said this, quote, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory," end quote. And this covered land from Ohio to Minnesota, and that included Wisconsin. So slavery was illegal here in the Northwest Territory, and that included this lead area we've been talking about. Just briefly, I want to talk about a couple words for African American people. The Ho-Chunk word, Washopini-seep, sometimes is translated as Black spirit, but is also sometimes translated as Black talker. One who talks a lot is the word for Frenchman. So sometimes this is translated as Black Frenchman. This is still often the term that Ho-Chunk speakers use today for African American people. Wakąjawįxka is the Anishinaabemowin word or Ojibwa word, an Algonquin dialect similar to Meskwake, which means black meat. And that's a complex idea. It's still a term that's used for some African Americans by Anishinaabe speakers. Pierre Bonga himself actually was often written about by this word, Wakąjawįxka, which some people thought then this was his name in Ojibwa, but in fact, it's what most even enslaved Blacks were called in Ojibwa in the late 18th and early 19th century. So when we're talking about this driftless lead boom, notice that Dr. Wachuta told us that in 1822, one of the first patents to mine lead was given at the Fever River. One of the people mining lead there was a free Black man, only 18 years old, named Jim Beckworth, who had gotten his freedom from his own white father in Missouri and embarked on the expedition to Galena. Quote, "The object for which the boat was dispatched up the Fever River was to make a treaty with the Sac Indians to gain their consent to our working the mines at that time in their possession," end quote. Notice there that Beckworth both acknowledges Meskwake and Sauk sovereignty, but also that he was part of lead mining, right? And he also says, this could be even sarcasm, "I remained in that region for the space of 18 months, occupying my leisure time by working in the mines." So notice, right, leisure time, most people aren't saying lead mining is leisure, but Jim Beckworth does this perhaps with a bit of irony, and he leaves with $700 cash in his pocket after 18 months, which at that time was quite a sum. Also at this time, further east, David Walker, a prominent Black haberdasher in Boston, writes a treatise against chattel slavery, condemning it in 1829. Among his points there, he contemns slavery in mining in the US. And he's talking about slavery in mining for lead in Ho-Chunk regions, and also in Challaga or Cherokee land, there's already gold mining going on at Dahlonega, Georgia. And Walker says, quote, "The whites are dragging us around in chains and in handcuffs to their new states and territories to work their mines and farms to enrich them and their children," end quote. So not only do you have free lead mine workers like Beckworth, and later you have free lead mine owners in the Driftless region, you have already some Black abolitionists condemning the use of slavery in mining. Here we have some pictures, a couple you've already seen, but this is 3 prominent enslavers from the lead district at this time. We have Henry Dodge there on the left, as well as George W. Jones and John Hawkins Roundtree. So these 3 men, they did various things in the history of Wisconsin and other parts of the upper Mississippi Valley. All were prominent politicians in due course. All were involved in the Black Hawk War to fully push Meskwaki and Saukee people out of the Driftless region. All mined for lead and all enslaved African Americans illegally in the Driftless region. And that's interesting. Sometimes people suggest that we should not focus on the fact that these early leaders of Wisconsin and Iowa were enslavers, but that's absolutely part of their legacy. And it's important for us to contemplate that. So here's another part that Dr. Wachuta kind of talked about some of this. He talked about Joseph Street, the Indian agent at Prairie du Chien, complaining, at least formally. So he says, quote, "Many are flocking to Dodge from Fever River, and he permits them to join him upon laying certain stipulated portions of the original purchase. The ore is more abundant, nearer to the surface, and obtained with greater facility than is ever known in this country. It is said that Dodge has raised about 500,000 of mineral, smelted 900 to 1,000 bars, and is smelting 50 bars a day. With 2 Negro men, he raises about 2,000 pounds per day," end quote. And Street is talking about some of the 5 African Americans whom Dodge brought with him from near St. Genevieve, Missouri in 1827. These are Tom, Joe, Jim, Lear, and Toby. And he brought them enslaved, promised them their freedom, but in fact kept them enslaved in Wisconsin territory, Free Michigan territory at that time, for almost 12 years. Also, ironically here, Joseph Street enslaved Patsy and London Triplet in his home in Prairie du Chien at this very time, along with 3 others. So at the same time, he's partially chiding Dodge for enslaving people and for producing a lot of lead. He himself is an illegal enslaver in Prairie du Chien. Here is a document that is held at the Joe Daviess County Courthouse. It is a deed of sale for the sum of $330, May 20th, 1830. Here it is transcribed. Part of this says, quote, "A Negro girl, a mulatto, aged 19 years, named Maria, no father, with her son Ward, a boy, aged 18 months and named Felix." This is the document with which John Roundtree, the founder of Platteville, used to purchase Maria, who was 19 years old in 1830, and her 18-month-old son, Felix. So some people have defended Roundtree's actions when he did this. Notice that slavery had been illegal in Wisconsin since 1787. It was also then illegal since Platteville was part of Free Michigan territory, and it was illegal where this was made in Free State of Illinois at Galena. So people like Roundtree were blatantly ignoring federal, state, territorial, and local laws when they were practicing slavery illegally in the upper Midwest. Also, to add complexity about the Black history of this story we've been unpacking, of this early story of the lead district at this time, notice here is part of Henry Dodge's muster roll in the Black Hawk War, which most historians and most Ho-chunks and most Meshkwake and Saké don't even call this a war. It really wasn't what most of us would think of as a war. But notice that among the other men who signed up into Dodge's company, both Joseph Dodge listed here, and Toby Dodge, two of the men whom Dodge enslaved and was still holding as slaves in 1832, they served in his company. And also ultimately Dodge got paid their wages for their service in the Black Hawk War. And this is very complicated. Here is the manumission, the document with which Dodge freed Tom, Jim, Joe, Lear, and Toby in 1838. It is a very significant document. It is held at the Southwest Wisconsin Room at UW-Platteville, and it is a fantastic document that I urge anyone who can get to that collection to view it. So Tom, Jim, Joe, Lear, and Toby get their freedom in 1838, but they'd been held enslaved illegally for almost 12 years. Some people champion Dodge for signing this paper. Notice then that he's already been the governor of the new free Wisconsin territory for 18 months when he finally feels compelled to free the 5 people he had been enslaving illegally. And so think about that. That's really quite something. A governor, the first territorial governor of Wisconsin, owned 5 people as property in a place where it was just being organized to be a free territory. That's a really uncomfortable truth. Again, my part of this story tonight shows you that African-American history and Indigenous history are often intertwined. A lot of this research that I have done over the past 4 years has been done with community partnerships, including everyone from Dr. Wachuta to Reverend Gus Barnes, to the Mining and Rollo-Jameson Museums, also the African American Historical Society Museum of the Black History Society and Museum of Wisconsin, including Claiborne Benson, the director. And so community partnerships, I think, is what we need to do going forward. Here are some of my students doing this research in the Southwest Wisconsin Room, which is an area research center of the Wisconsin Historical Society. And this is important work that needs to continue, and it needs to include institutions like the Mining and Rollo-Jameson Museum and other historical societies, museums, and institutions in this region. Also, students and community partners in 2019 helped restore the headstone of Rachel, a woman who was enslaved illegally by John Roundtree in Platteville. You can view her beautiful and moving headstone in the Hillside Cemetery in Platteville, and it's much prettier today. Here was a rededication ceremony for that headstone that was repaired in the summer of 2019. This ceremony was in the fall of 2019, and particularly was made possible by the partnership of Reverend Gus Barnes. One final thing I'd like to go out on here is that after Toby got his freedom in 1838, he would move to Mineral Point, Wisconsin, nearby. He would marry a woman named Adelaide, who had been enslaved earlier at Shullsburg. But in the 1850 census, Toby and Adelaide did an interesting thing. And this actually was common for many formerly enslaved African Americans in the 19th century. In the 1850 census, Adelaide and Toby listed the last name or family name for their sons, Joseph, Henry, and William, as Toby. So they ultimately would shed the name of their former enslaver, Dodge, or of Toby's former enslaver, Dodge, and would elevate Toby's name to remember and celebrate him. So the final thing I would like to remind us here is that while we are very excited to remember both beautiful and troubling chapters of African American history during Black History Month, that Black history and Indigenous history are important every month of the year, and they're part of the American story every day. I urge you, if you're a member of the Mining and Raleigh-Jameson Museums, or the Wisconsin Black Historical Society, or the Wisconsin Historical Society, or the Grant County Historical Society, to urge those institutions to amplify Black voices, not just in the historical record, but in whom they employ and whom they invite to share their message. So thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.
Great. Great job, Dr. Wachuta, Dr. Tesdahl. Awesome. So you covered some heavy and fascinating topics, and we do have a few questions. Others who have other questions that came to mind, please, this is your time to go ahead and type those in now via the Q&A function. Sarah asks, what books might you recommend that folks who want to do for outside reading do to learn a little bit more about these subjects? Gene, Josh?
One book that's very good for sort of the different cultures that came to the lead mining region in the 1820s is Lucy Murphy's book, A Gathering of Rivers, that speaks a lot about the history of both Native and Anglo-American mining, as well as the fur trade and sort of the different economic and social aspects of life here at that time. Another book that's gets a little bit more into the politics of Native versus US sovereignty in the region is a book called The Settler's Empire by Bethel, Saylor. And that's, like I said, a good one for understanding sort of the treaties and the politics.
And one more I would add, at least one more, is by Annalisa Cox, and it is called Bone and Sinew of the Land, and explores both enslaved African Americans in the upper Midwest in this earlier period, but also free African Americans in this region at that time.
Excellent, thank you. Joan Bennett asks, was Joshua Jones on Dodge's military roster and his aide-de-camp George Jones's slave?
Excellent question. I don't know. I've got his, we just looked at his roster, but I haven't explored that.
Mark Baker asks, is there evidence of slavery in Iowa County and specifically in mining and at Tower Hill, which is today a state park?
I don't know. I do know there was slavery at Gratiot's Grove, and that's not quite over there. But again, there was illegal enslavement at Portage, at Green Bay, many different places across the state, and that really increased during the mining boom. And particularly at smelting operations, because smelting, as we all might know, is generally a hot and dirty job. And so not always was that why people claimed that enslavement was necessary, but like in loading and offloading ships is also something that enslaved people were forced to do in various periods. And so smelting was another one of those. So could well be is the answer.
Perhaps warrants further research.
Absolutely.
Sarah asks if we know where in Mineral Point Toby and his family lived and what became of their descendants.
Yeah, we do, Sarah. Great question. And I know Sarah has done some work on that herself. I want to pull back up my PowerPoint here briefly. So my last slide here, or penultimate slide, this is the remnants of the Toby house, which is very near, which is just off Shake Rag Alley in Mineral Point and very near the Pendarvis, Wisconsin historical site. There's ongoing research going into this, particularly William Toby would get married and stay in Mineral Point the rest of his life and live in this house, raise a family there. And so it's important to remember too then that the Toby family, as well as right now I'm blanking on the last name, but Early, Edward and Henry Early, other free Black residents of Mineral Point, lived prominently in Mineral Point into the 1940s. So this is a really important topic, and more research can be done on it, and it is being done on it.
Excellent. Jennifer Wachuta asks, where is the Sugar River?
Great question. I will share my screen again here. The Sugar River is right on the eastern edge of the lead mining region in the Driftless area. The Sugar River diggings, where the Ho-Chunk had the really large mining operation described by Esau Johnson, was located very close to where New Glarus, Wisconsin is today, just a few miles away from New Glarus.
Okay, I will take this opportunity to interject a question of my own. Obviously, we're very interested in the location of the the metallic mineral deposits that were of such geopolitical importance. That area south of the Wisconsin River, west of the Sugar River, north of the Rock River. And but another commodity that I look forward to learning more about in the future had to do with mussels in the Sugar River, the Pecatonica River, and these mussels actually were discovered to have be prized for pearls that they contained, and they were fished nearly to extinction. And I don't know the exact value of those pearls, but my understanding is that it was significant. Do you recall reading anything about that resource in any of these treaties which you talked about?
So I don't think that any of the treaties specifically speak specifically about that resource, but that's certainly a resource that Native people used, and shell was a resource used in a lot of beads and other goods that were used for trade, for diplomacy. Dr. Tesdahl might be able to add even a little more to that. I'm not sure.
The only thing I will add is, again, I don't know of any mention of those in treaties, but yes, the use of mussels, not just for pearls, but also the meat was consumed and the shells were often turned into buttons. That industry really starts right at the tail end. We tried to chop off our talk today at about 1848 with Wisconsin statehood. A lot of that really kind of develops between 1848 and the mid 1850s. And then not only was important on some of these smaller rivers, but then really important and disastrous for mussel populations on the Mississippi River, places like Muscatine, Iowa, and elsewhere.
Thank you. Bill Robichaud asks, given all the troubling history discussed, Dodge a significant illegal intrusion onto Native American lands, engaging in illegal slavery. Have you heard of any moves afoot to rename the city of Dodgeville?
No, I haven't. So Henry Dodge has not just Dodgeville named after him, a state park named after him, a county named after him. He also has Fort Dodge, Iowa named after him. He also has Dodge City, Kansas named after him. And part of that is also due to the way that he supported the use of American Dragoon troops to push Plains nations off of Iowa and Kansas. Henry Dodge is a polarizing figure. Some people would definitely I know people who are angered by Dodge's actions. I haven't necessarily heard that as anyone calling to change the name of things named for him in Wisconsin. But of course, movements like this to change the name of various places or things named for various people has been happening in some parts of the country over the last few years.
So you answered one of Elaine's questions, but one that remains is for those who, for one reason or another, weren't able to listen to your talk live tonight, we'll be able to access a recording of this talk as soon as our museum staff has that edited. We'll be circulating that video link to ticket holders of either this talk or season ticket holders within the week. At some point after value has been derived by you value ticket holders, we will eventually make the talk available to the general public. Rebecca asks, about when did illegal slavery actually end in Wisconsin?
That's a great question. First, let me thank the Mining and Rollo-Jameson Museums for taping this broadcast and sharing it later. I think that's really helpful. Again, Rebecca, that's a wonderful question, right? Because new legislation wasn't required because it had never been legal in the area. The quick answer is that we see, unsurprisingly, that after Henry Dodge became territorial governor of a new free Wisconsin territory in 1836, that it became increasingly a liability for people like Dodge and George Wallace Jones at Cincinnati to claim African Americans as their property. It particularly became bad for business in some cases, and that was some of the pressure that urged some illegal enslavers in Wisconsin to free people. So Dodge was doing this by 1838. It's right around there when Jones starts to do the same. He will later move to Iowa and become one of the first senators of the free state of Iowa, although he will continue to write letters to his friend from youth, Jefferson Davis, and to express his pro-slavery views even while serving as a free state's governor. And the quick answer then, Rebecca, is by about 1848, to my research and some of my colleagues' research, not 48, 1842. By 1842, most African Americans held as human property in Wisconsin are freed across the state by 1842. But that's a very good question and a complicated one.
Dennis and Stephanie Cooley found your talk thought-provoking and informative, and they were very excited to share that remark. Bernard Lease says, wasn't there an African-American man from Grant County who served in the American Civil War?
Oh, there were many, about over 10 African-American men who served in the Union Army. There was a segregated unit for the 7th Wisconsin. Among them, this questioner might be thinking of Charles Shepherd. Charles and his son were both from Pleasant Ridge. So they walked from Pleasant Ridge near Lancaster to Prairie du Chien to enlist in the Union Army. And then I don't have a different slide in front of me right now, but of them, one was killed in Tennessee during battle. The other survived the whole war and then died of infection walking back from Tennessee to Grant County, Wisconsin. I believe it's Charles Shepherd. Interestingly, his name is on the Grand Army of the Republic monument at the Grant County Courthouse, and his race is not identified there. So that's actually pretty odd. A lot of those monuments, Black soldiers are not generally put on the same monument as white soldiers. So that's a pretty interesting fact here in Grant County, Wisconsin.
Lori asks, what happened to Marie and Felix? When did John Roundtree free them?
That's a great question. The quick answer is we do not really know. So far in my research, I have not found a fully conclusive date for when either of them left Roundtree. We do know that Rachel would leave. She's listed on his census data in 1830. The purchase was made in 1830. She does not show up on his census data in 1840 as an enslaved woman living in the Roundtree household. Felix, however, a boy of his age, is listed as still being enslaved by Roundtree in 1840, and so is Rachel, who I mentioned. But then by 1842, both Rachel and Felix are both freed by Roundtree. We don't know where Felix goes. 18 African-American men named Felix served in the Union Army for Wisconsin in the Civil War. I thought it might be easy to find out if Felix was one of those Felixes, and I have not found that yet, but I would love to know what happened to Felix.
Bill asks, what is the Chien village on the Wisconsin River on Dr. Wachuta's map?
Good question. So Chien was a Ho-Chunk man. That is his French name, which means dog's head in English. So to make the map bigger here. All of these village sites come from a variety of different sources, whether that be travelers' accounts, censuses that were done by the US Indian agents responsible for paying the treaty annuities out to these various villages, and different sources. So some of these names reflect the actual Ho-Chunk word for the place when that's known, like here at Portage or Baraboo or Ka-Chunk, the turtle village. Many of these other villages were only identified by the name of the person that the US agents regarded as the village leader. And in that case, it was Chien or Dog's Head. And this was located on what they called at the time English Prairie. There had been trade there between the Ho-Chunks and other native people and British fur traders. And this is now approximately the location of Muscadet, Wisconsin. I also, while I have the map up, I noticed there was another question just a little bit ahead asking about this white area. This was a reservation for the United States. So the white areas are not claimed by any native nation. They're claimed by the United States itself. And this was a reservation for military use because the US had a fort at Prairie du Chien. The fort was not on the side of the river, but this land had been reserved in a treaty for military use in case they wanted to put the fort there or in case there were resources on that tract of land that the military wanted.
Megan Duddle asks if you could speak a bit, Dr. Wachuta, about the ritual and how ritual interacted with Ho-Chunk lead mining. Who would have crafted these items, such as the lead turtles? Would they have been male or female?
Those are great questions, and we don't know a lot of detail because, or I don't know a lot of detail, because a lot of what I know about this is based on the archaeology, and of course that shows us the artifacts, but it doesn't necessarily illustrate the exact social practices. We know from accounts of Ho-Chunk lead mining that both men and women seem to be engaged in it. Possibly a little bit more co-equally than was the case with Meskwaki lead mining, where it seems women were really overwhelmingly responsible for mining in Meskwaki society. But there are many fewer written documents pertaining to Ho-Chunk lead mining, in part because the Ho-Chunk lead mining was more remote from American settlements and from the Mississippi River, where there were American travelers, making journals of their visits and so forth. So I don't know a lot of more specifics about these ritual uses, other than to say that we know that these effigies, based on the archaeology, seem to have been left in specific places on the landscape, where it seems like they may have been discarded intentionally as offerings or in some sort of ceremonial practice.
Mary Kritz asked a question, and just as a reminder to Mary that the recordings of these talks will be posted online, and those will contain the nice PowerPoint slides by the speakers. Robert Humphreys asks if there were Ho-Chunk communities that remained within the lead mining region in the 1840s or beyond, resisting removal.
So there were Ho-Chunks who continued to have relationships with the Ratchet's Grove community because of the good relationship that had been established with that family. And we know that Ho-Chunks at least came back to visit people that they knew at Ratchet's Grove into the 1840s and beyond. We also know that Ho-Chunks continued to have an important tie to the Rock River Valley, the eastern margins of the lead mining region, and continued at times to visit those locations. However, this was the region that drew the most white settlers initially in Wisconsin history. And it's clear from a lot of accounts that not only was the US military patrolling this region throughout the 1840s, looking for Ho-Chunk people to physically remove, but also that sometimes Ho-Chunks would even get permissions from US authorities or from fur traders, written papers, and try to come into former Ho-Chunk country and be attacked by settlers who tried to drive them back, even if they had papers or something signed by a US official. So it was difficult, and it's interesting today to think about the regions where the Ho-Chunk Nation has reestablished itself, that by far of the 3 treaties ceding land in Wisconsin, the least Ho-Chunk land today is in the lead mining region in that 1829 treaty. That seems to be the region that white settlers were the most proactive in colonizing. And of course, it's the lands that were more marginal to white economic uses further north that were still available for Ho-Chunk people to come back to later in the 19th century.
You've answered Kathy Paulskill's question, and Carly would like to know, Josh, if you're related to a Charles Wachuta from Prairie to Chien.
If it's the Charles Wachuta that I'm thinking of, who was alive in the earlier in the 20th century, I am very, very distantly related to him, but only as a very distant cousin.
Wonderful. Okay, we've got a member of the Haig family who has got a question about James D. Daniels. I know, Gene, you might be familiar of this mine owner, sometimes known as Negro Jim, who attended the Welsh immigrant church, called himself the only Negro Welshman in the world, and wondered if you might just speak briefly about your memories of him.
Sure. I think that person is talking about James D. Williams. And he migrated to Wisconsin as a free man sometime in the 1860s. To my knowledge, I don't know exactly when that was. We know that he served in the US colored troops in the Civil War, where he met many members of the Welsh community near Rui, Wisconsin, a place known as the Pecatonica Welsh settlement. We know, among other things, we know that James D. Williams came to own his own mine called the N-expletive Jim mine and we can only guess that he didn't choose that name for that mine, since it was a racial slur when it was used, and it appears on maps as recently for the US mining survey as recently as 1963. So that's a very disturbing term for remembering that James D. Williams was a Black entrepreneur and a free Wisconsinite in the 1860s. One more thing that this family member probably already knows, she might know where the Mount Carmel Church or Carmel Church is near Rui. That's where James D. Williams worshiped several times, we know. And there's a couple references of him even singing hymns in Welsh and dancing in the late 19th century. And he is buried there. His gravestone, I believe, is 1903. And it's a really wonderful monument. Great question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lynn asks if there was a debate about Black suffrage in the Wisconsin Constitution.
Yes, there was. There's a wonderful article by my colleague at UW-Madison, Dr. Christy Clark-Pujara. That article appeared just a few years ago in the Wisconsin Magazine of History. That debate, which again, a free territory merging into a free state, one might assume that Black male suffrage would be easily passed in the 1840s, but it wasn't. And so that was really contested for a very long time, though some municipalities handled that better than others. But I urge that person to read Dr. Christy Clark-Pujara's article.
Excellent. Kathy Paulskull points out that there's an interesting WPR Chapter a Day series on now, reading a book that chronicles Black service members in the Civil War. Amy Haig, who I know now lives out east, says she lived across from 151 from the Hillside Cemetery in her youth, visited the graves of the Roundtree family and the people they enslaved many times, and she was delighted to learn of your restoration of Rachel's grave. I just in conclusion would like to thank both of you for your time in preparing this talk, for sharing your expertise with us. And my final question is, was there a time when this frontier would have been of national importance? And how were some key American figures, I guess, impacted by their time dealing with matters in the lead mining district?
I'll start with that, but I'll let Dr. Wachuta finish it. The lead extracted from the Driftless region of Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin is one of the largest mineral extractions in North American history. And it was, while it wasn't as lucrative as gold, ultimately it was so much more lead was coming out of places like Platteville, Wisconsin in the 1820s than Dahlonega, Georgia with its gold at that time, that actually it was more lucrative, one can say. And so we've already mentioned some of the political figures who would go on to prominence. Lewis Cass was pretty involved with events in this area as well, who also became a national figure. And I'll just stop there.
Yeah, and I would add, these, given the significance of the lead deposits and the economic importance of the Mississippi River as a travel and trade corridor, this was a region that attracted national attention in the 1820s and 1830s. The meeting with John Adams was something that he wrote about in his own diary. There are several entries in John Quincy Adams' diary about his dealings with the was also a lot of national news in newspapers in New York and Washington, D.C. because this was a region that people, even on the East Coast, were interested in.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, gentlemen, very much. And I'd like to invite those who would like to learn a little bit about not only this district, but some of the other interesting mining districts across the state of Wisconsin to tune in at the same time next Sunday for Brad Gottschalk, Platteville Zone, to present an overview of Wisconsin mining history. He has been the archivist for the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey for many years, and we'll look forward to welcoming him then. Thanks to all for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Good night.